that day. And so with that, I think we are at the start point for the meeting. So welcome everybody to the check-in meeting. We've got a fair amount of material that's in the final stages. So today's very much about preparations to clear the way for formal approvals at the March meeting. We're not doing approvals today because obviously in terms of the check-in meetings, we've had the convention that we don't do approvals or anything like that in the check-ins, but it's still important in terms of working through the final stages on 3 key projects. I'd like to start by formally welcoming our 3 new board members for joining the board this year for 2023. In alphabetical order, I guess, first one is Noyati Ahmad, who is the new board member from Malaysia. So Noyati, welcome. A number of you will have had the opportunity to meet her when she was able to attend the September meeting. So it's great to have you in the board, and we look forward to hearing the benefit of your experience in implementing accrual for the government in Malaysia. The second new board member is by now not a stranger to us, Andrew van der Burg from South Africa, who has replaced Lindy. So Andrew, welcome in your new capacity as a board member. And then the final new board member is Jonah Wala from Kenya. And I'm just looking around the screen. I can't see Jonah with us at the moment. Am I missing him on the screen somewhere? Oh, Jonah, there you are. Hi, welcome. Great to see you. Okay, in terms of today's meeting, I see Lynn has made it, so congratulations, Lynn, on the travel. We have 2 apologies, or 3 apologies actually, I should say, from Todd, Camira, and Adrienne for various different reasons, but everybody else is now with us. One piece of breaking news. I hope she won't mind me. I'm not trying to embarrass you here, Lucy, but Lucy put in the chat that she's just had the excellent news that she's one of the recipients of the 100 recipients of the Accountancy Centenary Award of Excellence from the Philippines Regulatory Board of Accountancy. They're celebrating 100 years of the accountancy profession in the Philippines. So well done, Lucy. Congratulations on that. Very well deserved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was meant for you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So congratulations, Lucy. That is excellent. Excellent news. I think with that, Ross, anything else we should do under the administrative announcements before we move
yes.
into
Just one quick announcement from me, Ian, and that's just to note to members, TAs, observers, that we have a new staff member who's joined us from January 2023, Christoph Braxton, who you can see on the screen. He's currently based in South Africa, but in the process of obtaining work permits and visas to relocate and join the team in Canada. You'll get to know Christoph a little bit better in a couple weeks in Washington, as he'll be working at first on the retirement benefits plan and taking us through the responses to that exposure draft as we finalize the guidance in that project. So welcome to the team, Christoph, and looking forward to having you supporting our work.
Thanks, Ross. Yes, and very welcome, Christoph. Look forward to meeting you in Washington. Okay, so with that, we move into item 1 on the agenda, which is measurement. So I think over to you, Dave, to kick us off on that.
Thank you, Chair, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the February meeting. As Ian mentioned, we'll be going through measurement to kick things off. Not a whole lot to go through in this agenda item today. We have the first issues paper, which focuses on deemed costs, which is addressing an instruction from the board in December. The second issues paper is really a discussion we wanted to have with the board. All staff got together and discussed effective dates that we'll hopefully be looking to approve on various projects in March. And we thought it was important that members had the chance to digest the information a few weeks in advance, so you weren't trying to juggle something else in March. And then finally, and I'll just give a quick overview of this, just a for-your information paper where I highlighted what to expect going into March with the expected approval of measurement. So that's the plan for today, and I'll jump right into agenda item 1. So agenda item 1, as I mentioned, is addressing a board decision, or sorry, a board instruction from December 2022, where the board instructed staff to make some adjustments to the guidance to allow for current operational value to be used to measure property, plant, and equipment on initial recognition or initial measurement. So that's what the drafting group did. And I guess the key takeaway from the agenda item is the drafting group worked very diligently in December in the collaborative time to develop guidance for the board to consider in December. And what's really changed between the guidance that was looked at by the board in December and now is the drafting group and staff have had time to really reflect on it and make sure that all the changes that should be captured in amendments to other IPSAS, specifically IPSAS 33, were captured and tightened up the wording. So in principle, the changes are consistent with what the board looked at in December, but just more robust based on the drafting group and staff having additional time to consider. So the recommendation is that the IPSASB take the drafting group's proposals on how to take the December instruction forward on deemed cost.
So thanks very much for the introduction, Dave, and thank you very much to those who participated in the drafting group discussions, not only the ones this year, but also during the finalisation stage. Really has been a huge help, and it's moved us a long way. So thank you very much for that. In terms of, I know there are a few final drafting suggestions floating around, and in order to allow staff to implement those in the draft that we have to vote on at the March meeting, if you can pass any further suggested editorials to staff by close today, Toronto time, that would be really helpful, because that will allow them to include those or address those in the final draft. And we're up against posting deadlines next week, so unfortunately that is a hard deadline. With that, just wanted to pause and check whether there are any additional non-editorial points that board members wanted to raise at this stage. Yeah, so I've got Patricia and then Lucy.
And thank you. I support the majority of the paragraphs in the proposed here, but sometimes the deemed costs is present as a surrogate for cost, sometimes for transaction price. And I think that for better understand and for alignment with the decision made in about the initial measurement in conceptual framework, I think the paragraph about the initial measurement should be changed or modified in accordance with paragraph 7.5 and 7.6 in conceptual framework, because this it's possible to understand how when the paragraphs say about the cost and when paragraphs say about the cost, so transaction price. I don't know if you ask about each paragraph, or it's only to present general comments in the moment?
Yeah, I think it's sort of general comments, and I think Tricia, on that first point, I think that's well made, because we did do a lot of work in that area in the framework. So if you can work with staff to make sure that we've got absolute consistency in terminology and drafting, and in the draft IPSAS, that would be really helpful.
Yes, I made my comment and I will send it after the meeting. Another general comment is, I think in the case of the link with revenue, I think it's because the link with revenue is because of the measurement for non-financial assets received as a consideration. In this case, I think it's better to modify the general principles and indicate only the exceptions. The exception in this moment is in relation to PP&E, and not to list each IPSAS, because I'm not sure that the list is exhaustive or consider every assets that the entity can receive as a consideration. It's my main comments, and other comments I will send offline. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Dave, perhaps to you on that.
On your first point, Patricia, what I'll ask is after the meeting, if you just stay on for a few minutes, we can work through to make sure we're consistent with the conceptual framework and make sure I capture those. On your second point on paragraph 43, I take your point on providing the general principle and providing the exception on PP&E. The reason we didn't do that was because this is an amendment to another IPSAS, we didn't want to make too many changes to the paragraph, and the paragraph already lists the standards that you identified. So as a result, we kept the same convention that was previously there and didn't alter the substance of paragraph 43 and IPSAS 23.
Okay, Dave, thanks for that explanation. Perhaps you can, Tricia, if there's specific issues on that, you think anything you think's been admitted, perhaps you can liaise with staff afterwards on that.
Yes, only to reply in relation to the last issue, last question. And IPSAS 33 indicates other types of assets that not PP&E, intangibles, financial, and inventories. My concern here is indicate only this type of assets, and maybe the entity can receive an assets classified in other as other type of assets that not intangible, PP&E, financial, or inventories.
Thanks, Tricia. Dave, back on that.
I was just going to say, Patricia, since we're hopefully going to talk after the meeting for a few minutes to clear up the conceptual framework, let's get on the same page there as well and make sure I've got the right paragraph.
Okay, thanks for that. So then I've got Listy, Noyati, Andrew, and then Mary.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. My comment actually is on the consequential amendments to paragraphs 42 and 43 of IPSAS 23, which are presented in the appendix. I noticed that these amendments were also included in IPSAS 45, the draft of the IPSAS 45 that was sent to us, that was sent to the editorial group for comment. However, in the draft for IPSAS 45, IPSAS 41, which is on financial instrument, and IPSAS 31 were not mentioned in paragraph 43. Now, since IPSAS 45 and IPSAS 46 will be published at the same time, my question is, would it be appropriate to mention the same consequential amendments to paragraph 42 and 43 of IPSAS 23 in both IPSAS 45 and IPSAS 46? Or should the consequential amendments be either discussed in IPSAS 45 or IPSAS 46? I compared the two discussion on other amendments to IPSAS 2023. I noticed that there are additional amendments in paragraph 43 of IPSAS 23 in IPSAS 46. So I suggest that the amendments to paragraphs 42 and 43 of IPSAS 23 be discussed in IPSAS 46 instead of IPSAS 45 to eliminate duplication. I think I haven't gone through the other amendments, but it might be the same. I mean, the situation might be the same where the same consequential amendments are discussed in both IPSAS 45 and 46. So I think that's one thing that we have to consider to avoid duplication. My other comments are on actually editorial, and
I'll just go back to Ross for a moment on that, because I think Ross wants to come in on your first point.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for flagging that, Lucy, and we will check to make sure consistency between them. We're not modifying the same paragraph in different ways, but we don't think it would be appropriate to put the amendments in one document together for two separate IPSAs, because it's important to show the impact of the changes to a particular standard across the guidance. But, you know, as we've finalized 45 earlier, I think there is a need that we go back and check and make sure there's no overlap of adjustments, which we will do in the editorial process to make sure they're consistent. And just to make sure you're comfortable, we do have a control at the end of the process when we do the handbook that there is only one paragraph, and we will only be able to make one set of consolidated edits to the document. So, but thanks for flagging that, and we are in the process of doing that consistency check.
Okay, thanks, Ross. So Lucy, you have another point before I go to Noyati.
Yeah, my other points are actually editorial, so I would appreciate if Dave could pass to us a Word version of the draft IPSAS so we can, you know, give our suggested edits and comments. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. I think that's a good practical suggestion. Okay, with that, pass over to Noyati.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to give a short comment. Actually, we agree with the changes proposed. However, we observe that IPSAS do not use the transaction cost terminology for its initial measurement, and it remains at cost. For example, paragraph 27 of IPSAS 16 saying that investment property states that investment property shall be measured initially at its cost, where the transaction cost shall be included in this initial measurement. Just we want to clarify whether the transaction price is similar to cost, or is there any, you know, it's quite similar to Patricia, because it will reflect on the other IPSAS as well. So it's more on the whether that the transaction price is similar to cost and be consistent in developing the other or changes the other IPSAS as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's got Noyati. Dave, you want to come back on that?
I guess so, Noyati, we have considered the difference between transaction price, transaction cost in the measurement IPSAS 46. So hopefully that will be cleared up on a detailed read through. But I think your point that maybe is more relevant is, as part of phase 2 of the measurement project, we will go through and consider deemed cost and current operational value throughout IPSAS. So we will ensure that wording is more consistent through IPSAS as part of phase 2 of the project.
Mm-hmm.
So I think your reference to IPSAS 16, which investment properties will be considered as part of that phase. And you'll see a paper on that at the March meeting.
Okay, thanks for that. Dave. Andrew, to you.
Thanks, Ian. I think perhaps similar to Patricia, I picked up a couple of inconsistencies perhaps with the original consequential amendments that we reviewed pre-December. And I think they've creeped in because of the changes we made to PPE, COV, in December and going forward with that. So I'm happy to stay on afterwards with Patricia and Dave and bash those out as well.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. That would be really much appreciated. Mary, to you.
Thank you. My concern is about the intangible assets, IPSAS 31, and my concern is about maybe the BC 15 division of IPSAS 31 as a result of IPSAS 46 measurement, and it mentioned about the IPSASB concluded intangible assets have a single use, and I wonder this description single use is the meaning of the single use is maybe the clarified. From my point of view, it's so important. Maybe that there is no description about the financial capacity and operational capacity and the IPSAS 31, and so maybe the IPSASB concluded. If the IPSASB said IPSASB concluded intangible assets have a single use, the meaning of the single use will be required to be clarified, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I mean, it does, all of these comments show actually how complex it is actually getting the interrelationships right. And then we've approved phase 2, and we've got the limited scope update of IPSAS 31 to look at that in detail. But I think there may well be therefore a bit of wording that we need to make sure is correct in that context of those various other moving parts. So Dave, if you can work with Mary on that, that would be really helpful. So Mary, if you've got any particular suggestions on drafting, please pass those through to Dave. And then I've got Renee now.
Yes, good day, everyone. You can hear me well?
Yeah, we can.
So I want to make a general comment here, and it's about the impact may be addressed here in the measurement standard, but it's related to edits that we made as part of this round of edits in the revenue standard, where we searched and replaced fair value for current value in some of the spots. So we reflected on the use of the term current value. And when you come back into the measurement standard or other standard, it's kind of a hit and miss on how current value is used. In fact, if we start with the measurement standard, which in my mind is the starting point of measurement, current value is used in the context of a current value model. If you do a word search on current value, I think 99% of the time, it refers to the current value model, not the current value itself. I think there's current value measurement too that I've seen in the measurement standard. So when we look at the model, we know there are 3 current values, right? And we have our new COV, fair value, and the other one. So I'm wondering if there would be benefit to clarify what we mean, like something quick, that current value is one of the 3 values under the current value model. Because when we're in those other standards like revenue, and someone looks at current value as being the guidance I'm getting, well, what current value? They need to understand that it's those 3 values that are under the current value model. So it seems trivial, but I just wanted to raise it to see if maybe there would be benefit there to strengthen what we mean by current value, that it is, though we haven't explicitly said it, I think, in the measurement standard. That's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Renee. Dave, any immediate reaction to that?
No, I take your point. I completely understand it, Renee. I don't have an immediate reaction or an immediate solution. I don't know whether the fix is in IPSAS 46 or 47. I think it's 46 is what you're suggesting. So maybe let me take it away and think about it, Renee. Maybe I'll reach out to you, or if it's clear to me, I'll propose something for March. But I think to your point, maybe it's a sentence somewhere.
Yeah, and obviously that would need to be consistent with the framework update that we've already approved, and that may well be the source for that, to get that language right. Okay, so thanks very much for those points, everyone. I think this is exactly the process that we need to go through, and it does underline the sort of, you know, the kind of slightly unusual and pervasive status of the measurement standard. Thanks very much for those. So Dave will circulate that Word version so people can put final edits through on that. That will be really helpful. And then obviously we've got those specific actions there to work with different board members just to resolve those issues, and in particular the consistency points with the framework update and so on. And I think that underlines why we're doing this now rather than trying to fix it all through the December meeting. And then to underline Ross's opening point that we do have the standard editorial process as well to pick up as a sort of final safety net in terms of these things. Dave, anything else on that first item then from you?
Nothing else from me.
Okay, so do you want to move us then into the second item on effective dates?
So as I noted at the very beginning, the second item really is for board discussion. No decision is required today. You'll make a decision on effective dates in March when you're approving each of the pronouncements. But staff got together a few weeks ago and talked about how all the effective dates interplay, and wanted to make sure the board had sight of it and was able to discuss it and provide views so that there's less moving parts in a couple of weeks in Washington. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. Staff did consider a number of factors, how interrelated the projects were, staggering of effective dates, those type of factors. But starting at the very top of the slide, we have ED 43 and, sorry, that should be IPSAS, not ED, IPSAS 43 and IPSAS 44, leases and non-current assets. Those have both approved and have standing effective dates of January 1st, 2025. Staff saw no reason to change the effective dates on those. IPSAS 45 and IPSAS 46, PP&E and measurement. With IPSAS 45, you'll see that in the red text, it's dependent on IPSAS 43, IPSAS 44, and IPSAS 45. So the effective date of IPSAS 45 can't be before measurement, leases, or non-current assets. And the reason that staff thought the January 1st, 2026 effective date was appropriate because we'd always issued those as a package, and we thought it'd be appropriate to continue to issue those as a package. And then finally, at the bottom, you see IPSAS 47 and 48 and revenue and transfer expenses. Again, we always saw those as a package, so we thought we'd issue those as a package or set an effective date as a package. And then we thought that should be the last effective date because staff discussed and thought revenue and transfer expenses would be the most revenue intensive to adopt and implement in practice, and thought that there might be an appropriate amount of lead in time to ensure that appropriate resources could be identified. So I'll stop there, Ian, and happy to listen to this discussion that we can factor into any recommendations we make in March. Oh, Ian, I'll just make a point that Kamira had a point you want me to share, and I'll feed that in as part of the discussion.
Yeah, okay, that's good. So, I mean, obviously this is not for decision today. Very much want to get sense of members' views. I think particularly it would be good to see whether members have views on whether IPSAS 45 and 46 need to be delayed by a year, or whether they could be brought in with an effective date of 2025, given that those 45, IPSAS 45 obviously is a clarification and builds, you know, is very closely based on IPSAS 17. So question mark degree of change associated with that. And also with measurement, what that provides is clarity of guidance rather than necessarily major systems changes. So I think that's one of the things that would be good to get board members' comments on that. Revenue and transfer expenses, inevitably there will be some dependencies then on the finalisation and whether we decide on re-exposure for either or both of those. So with those sort of opening remarks, perhaps I can open the floor for comments from board members. Yeah, Andrew, you're first off the blocks.
Thanks, Ian. I tend to agree with your thoughts. I think when running through this, I think, IPSAS 44, sort of a exception standard, shall we say, not really one that's going to have a lot of impact. Lisa, sure. PPE, I sort of agree with you, similar to what we've had before, with a little bit of clarification to it. And then some additional guidance coming through in measurement as well. So I didn't necessarily initially think that there would be a need to delay PPE and measurement by another year, and rather move those to 2025. As you say, revenue and transfer expenses, we'll have to see where we go with re-exposure. I also wondered if we considered potentially looking at transition groups for those, just to help constituents implement those standards, given the complexity, particularly I think around revenue. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So I'll take a round of comments from board members and then go back to staff for thoughts. So if I can go to Lynn next and then Claudia.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So what I was reflecting on is we don't want an unintended consequence of people having to measure something one way, then measure it another way. So I was quite in favour really of 45 and 46 being brought forward to 2025. If we think they're better standards, if we think they're filling a gap, why wouldn't we get on with it? I wasn't clear why we would delay, so I guess I was in favour of 25 on those. And I think it could be neater then in terms of leases as well.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Claudia and then Scott.
Thank you very much. Principle, I can follow the arguments why we have to link all of the 4 standards. I only see a little bit the risk that we haven't finished the leases phase 2, and what is the consequence of the effective date of the leases phase 2 standard. There was, I think, the discussion when we agreed on the effective date of the lease standard, that we said we will reconsider if the date is still reliable if we came with the phase 2 lease project. That's the only thing we should keep in mind in our thinking about the relationship. So otherwise, and the only thing is, I'm not sure if countries like where we have an endorsement process, we could make it possible to have then already property, plant and equipment ready 1 year earlier, because we have to at first figure out, is there any consequences before we can go to the government to ask to approve for the endorsement process like we have. But it's not an issue at all, because it doesn't, it's independent from the standards itself.
Okay, thanks, Claudia. So I'll just take comment from Scott and then go back to staff at that stage, and then Liang, I'll come to you after that, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I just wanted to speak in support of moving 45 and 46 up to 2025. I think it makes sense. I think actually staggering it may create more issues in the back. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Ross and/or Dave.
Maybe I'll just go first with a couple top level comments. So in thinking of why they're staggered, it was really thinking about the adoption implementation of the standards, and that we like to give 18 months as a minimum before a new standard comes into effect. So if the board decides that it would like 45 and 46 to go a year earlier, that's definitely feasible. But we were thinking about the issue that Claudia noted, that many national standard setters do have their own endorsement processes and their own need to consult once we finalize a document. And this is a large number of new standards. We haven't had a big group like this for a number of years. And I don't recall, at least in my time with the staff, of us ever having a group this big on so many different topics that weren't directly related. So it is a challenge. Although the changes to 45 and 46, I agree, aren't extensive, it still is work that the national standard setters and users of the standards will have to work through. Did want to note that early adoption is permitted for those who want to go sooner. So we're not tying people's hands by putting them later. If users of the standards or national standard setters wanted to set their own dates and align those, they would have the ability to do that. And if the board decided to keep the stagger as proposed, we could emphasize that in the communication documents to make sure people are aware. But it is a decision board members will take when they finalize the standards, and we could push those forward and it wouldn't cause any problem from our standard setting perspective. Just one point to Claudia I'd like to note, and then I will throw it back to Dave because I'm sure there's some detailed points he wants to emphasize. But on the phase 2 leases and phase 2 measurements, we don't think, and staff did think about this specifically about this previous discussion we had about trying to align those amendments with the date. And we kind of think that that's a challenging approach when you're setting the standards, because again, when we approve those amendments, whatever they may be, we'll set an effective date for those amendments and we'll amend the guidance that exists. That's traditionally how we deal with the alignment of the guidance. It's very challenging in a standard setting environment for us to pre-plan an effective date of a new standard to bring in new amendments to that standard. And the only time I think I've seen it done well or effectively was when the ISB brought in IFRS 9, which was extremely complicated, and they built that actual standard in pieces. But what we're doing with leases phase 2 is we're considering transactions that aren't currently addressed in the standard, and we'll amend the standard for any additional guidance we add on to that standard. And those amendments will have an effective date, whatever the board deems appropriate at that time. And I don't think it's something that has to be the same as the standard itself. And staff has a pretty strong view on that. Measurement phase 2, which you didn't mention, but I think that's a follow-on conversation as well. Again, we'll be amending other standards for the measurement standard. And again, when we decide to make those amendments, we'll process those amendments and they'll have effective dates for the various other standards. And there's no need to align those measurement phase 2 changes with the measurement standard itself. If it happens they're aligned, that's fine. But if time it takes to do the standard setting doesn't give us time to give people time to implement those changes, then we shouldn't be afraid to use a different effective date. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Dave, anything you wanted to add before I go to Leanne?
No, one more point. I thought Russ did a really good job of answering phase 2. I just wanted to go back on Lynn's point on bringing PP&E and measurement forward a year. We talked about bringing forward measurement to 2025, Lynn, and we didn't see a problem with that. We talked about the 4 measurement bases that are introduced, and 3 of the 4, fair value, historical cost, and cost of fulfillment, already exist in IPSAS, so it's just providing more guidance. So while there's always, I guess, the devils are in the details, it's not, I don't think, a massive lift on those 3. And then current operational value, the first time it's discussed is in property, plant, and equipment. So if property, plant, and equipment stayed in 2026, the lift to adopt measurement in 2025 wouldn't be that large. So we talked about having measurement a year earlier than property, plant, and equipment. We didn't think about property, plant, and equipment in 2025, but if the board would like us to try and push that kind of stuff forward, we're happy to take that away and think about that for March.
Okay, thanks for that. So I'll take comments then from Liang, Abdullah, and Lucy, and then we'll sort of wrap up where we've got to at that stage. Liang, to you.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I think it is a good approach to have not too many standards to be effective in the same year. As from implementation perspective, if we have too many new standards, such as 4 or 4 above new standard to be effective at the same year, I think it is too suffering to the preparer and the auditors. So I generally agree with staff's proposal that we could have 2 standards to be effective at the same year. My only concern is for the lease phase 2 and the measurement phase 2. Actually, ideally, I think maybe I understand these two projects may be a bit more difficult, but ideally, I think the effective date of the phase 2 may be better if not too delayed or too late after the effective date of the phase 1. That's my suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks, Liang. Abdullah, and then Lucy.
Thank you, Chair. I have just 2 comments. The first one would be just, I would agree with the staff not to push too many standards and separate them around the years. We are talking about capacity building within the public sector, which is, you cannot push too many standards, and these standards are in nature are public sector specific. So we would want people to swallow them, to understand them well. There is always the option with early adoption. So Omepar would want to have an early adoption, then that the option is there, and we can have one thing in addition. If any of the early adopters would want to come forward and just to present their case, that would be something good that would help us to understand how it's going with the implementation. The second thing that I might have just something to have about revenues with the, when you are talking about leases, there is a component with the revenue side with, and 43 is going in 25, but it's still revenues is going in a 26 or 27. How would we deal with that? Would we have something in there? But other than that, early adoption option is also working fine, and shouldn't be a problem for us to just have different years. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdullah. Ross, you want to come back on the revenue point that Abdullah made?
Yeah, because Abdullah, that's a good point, and we did think about that. The board thought about it when IPSAS 43 was approved, that we needed a temporary fix on the revenue portion of the leases guidance. And with that, in the current IPSAS 43, there's a reference to IFRS 15 as a stopgap. Now that stopgap will exist until our revenue standard is approved and the amendments to leases come in and amend that to the new IPSAS 47 on revenue. So again, you might recall an earlier discussion where we talked about trying to align those effective dates, and it's really not feasible. The better way is to amend the standard once we have a new revenue standard and take out the IFRS 15 reference and replace it with revenue. But because our model is built on IFRS 15, if someone starts on IFRS 15, they're not going to be having revenue challenges when they go to our public sector revenue standard, because the models are consistent in principles. So we don't think there's a need to align those effective dates, and that means that people can move quicker on adopting the leases standard, which is probably the most complex in this list compared to current guidance, other than maybe IPSAS 47 revenue itself. So having some space between those two is probably the real value add to the preparer community that's going to have to use these standards.
Thanks, Ross. So we'll take Lucy and then a comment from Thomas, and then I think we wrap this discussion up, because I think we've heard a range of comments and factors we need to consider. Lucy.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I am also for the moving forward to January 1, 2025, the effectivity of IPSAS for the 5 and 46. I checked the effectivity dates of all the IPSASs that we have issued. And I noticed that there are 9 IPSASs where they were effective in 2008, for instance, or IPSAS 1, 3, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, and then 22 and 23. These are not related IPSASs, but we were able to fix the same effectivity date on or after January 1, 2008. And then there are also 6 IPSASs where we had the effectivity dates was January 1, 2017, that is 33 to 38. I think the the value of moving forward the effectivity of the two IPSASs, especially IPSAS 46, is that the issues that might be crop up in the implementation of IPSAS 43, 44, 45, and 46 would be very good inputs in the next in the measurement phase 2 project. So I would like to support the recommendations of other board members that we push forward the implementation of IPSAS 45 and 46. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisvik. Thomas, I'll go to you and then back to Dave. And then I'll sum up.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Ian. Just a short comment regarding, from a public interest perspective, regarding the effective date for revenue. I appreciate what Andrew said regarding the re-exposure and what Abdullah said in terms of early adoption. I just want to say that we need to prepare us not to be too early, but on the other side, it can be too long until standards come into effectiveness. We see a lot of interest of people out there at the moment in the revenue project. There is a lot of training going on. So there's also a negative aspect if we kind of postpone it too late, wait 3.5 years or more than 3 years, that it's getting a little bit, the interest is getting a little bit lost and the momentum is getting a little bit lost. So there's a balance. Yes, leave enough time for preparers, but on the other side, keep the momentum, as everybody is now very keen on improving the revenue recognition in their accounting. Thanks.
Thanks, Thomas. So Dave, to you, and then I'll sum up on where I think we've got to.
So very timely comment, Thomas, because I wanted to feed in Kamira's point that was similar to the public interest point. And she just indicated specifically with revenue, but maybe more broadly, that our constituents have been waiting a long time for these standards. There's lots of interest specifically in revenue. And she just, I don't want to butcher her words, but she encouraged the board to consider bringing these in as soon as possible to make sure that people aren't waiting too long for these. And I think Thomas said it better than how I said it, but just an interesting perspective I want to make sure was captured.
So thanks for that, Dave, and thanks to the board members for a very good conversation, I think, which brought out the various different factors that we're going to have to weigh here. And I think, if you like, the primary factor here is going to be that the two standards that are creating major changes are leases and revenue. Those are going to be the two big changes, and we know, and Andrew referred to the point about the transition resource groups that ISB used, and I think undoubtedly that's something that we need to sort of have a think about in this context. Here, I think I've heard arguments both ways actually, in terms of if we're looking at IPSAS 45 on PP&E and also the measurement standard. I think whichever way we go on this, there's a lot of material that needs to be digested, and I think there are some questions. I think Thomas, made the point in the context of revenue, but I think it also applies to these standards as to whether there really is a need to delay for another year, or whether in their nature they can be brought in earlier. And I think there is this point about earlier, adoption can be, we permit that. But in terms of what I'm hearing, I think maybe the new standards, actually it would be appropriate to look to an effective date of 2025 for those, unless they're really, and I recognise the practical points that have been made by members, unless you know, and perhaps this can be discussed offline, unless there really is a fatal flaw in that, then I think probably responding to what I think is sort of perhaps the majority amongst the members, we should be working on 2025 as the effective date for those two standards. We will need to consider revenue and transfer expenses separately for both for the practical implementation issues, and then also how does that work if we decide on re-exposure on those. So I think that's probably where we get to out of that discussion, recognizing there is no right answer. So you know, perhaps if any member feels that there really is you know, there really is a fatal flaw in that, perhaps they can have a conversation with Dave and beforehand, and we can bring that back in March. But otherwise, I think that's probably where the consensus lands within the board on that. So with that, Dave, can you just take us into the final part of the discussion, which is really just teeing up what the approval process will be when we get to the March meeting?
Sure. So what I really wanted to highlight here was just what the board can expect going into March and what to expect going into approval. So I'll address any deemed cost instructions that come out of today's meeting. As Ian mentioned earlier, if members can provide any editorial comments on measurement by the end of day today, I will send around a Word version of the documents while we're talking about revenue over the next few minutes. You'll also see in March, you'll see an agenda item that we've drafted that discusses phase 2 of measurement and what that's going to cover. We thought that would help members understand where the bifurcation line was between the two projects and help with approval of IPSAS 46. What you'll see in the agenda item for measurement, or IPSAS 46, right now I'm planning to have one agenda item, and that will just be the approval item. You'll have due process in there and explanation of the entire process, but it should be a short read. So a shorter read than you've seen recently. And then just a reminder, as always, we'll initiate our final editorial review coming out of the March meeting, and that's a process that's always there, but we will make sure that any final edits are picked up through that process.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So we wanted to be very clear with members that we're not going to do any further editorials or anything like that in the March meeting. It literally will be we'll be voting on the basis of the draft document that staff brings forward, and any final proposed edits can be dealt with through the editorial process afterwards. So it will be you know, the document that you will see. We will be voting on that, and that will go through the formal process that we always do when we get to approvals on that. We wanted to make sure members are very clear on that. Can I just check if there are any questions on expectations for that session in March? Okay, good. I think that was very clear. So thanks to staff for the work in bringing this together. Thanks to members for all the comments, and just to underline that close of play Toronto today is the deadline for suggested edits to be included in the version that we will vote on in March. So with that, I think we will then move on to revenue and transfer expenses. And I think that's over to you, Eileen.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to share my screen to start. So good morning, everyone. Agenda item 2 will be covering both the revenue project as well as the transfer expense project, and included 3 papers in total. The first paper is informational only, and there are no decisions required, and is intended to highlight and provide an update on the 2-year journey that we have been on since we received responses to the original EDs, and helping to really lay out the next steps and what the planned approach will be in March when we are in DC for our March meeting. Now, on the revenue side, since the December 2022 meeting, staff in the drafting group have developed IEs and also revised the amendments to other IPSAS, and we'll be discussing those later today in the second and third agenda items for the two projects. On the revenue side, we also made minor revisions based on member comments that were received in the December session or offline, as well as updates based on the discussions with the measurement project lead, Dave, on the usage of current operational value, and also the amendments to 23, which have potential implications for the revenue IPSAS 47. For transfer expenses, we made similar progress on illustrative examples and amendments, and also made some minor revisions to other guidance based on member comments. Now, what the board can expect at the March session in 2-3 weeks' time is an updated version of the two IPSAS, and we'll be reflecting changes from this current version based on any comments we've received offline, as well as comments we'll receive today from members. And these will be in track changes for easier review. But the intention for March is similar to for measurement, that we won't be doing a page flip because we have been through a detailed review over the last few meetings of all of the different sections, and a majority of our time will be focused on the discussions and voting process for approvals and re-exposures of the two projects. Now, given the tight turnaround between today and the March posting date that we have, I would just echo what the chair has already highlighted earlier today, that we'd appreciate any editorial comments that you might have for us offline so that we can process that as quickly as possible for the March posting. So with that, I will take a pause and see if there are any questions from members about the overall progress on the two projects and the plan for March at this point.
So I think just before we take any questions, probably the same point goes as for measurement, that if Eileen, you can distribute Word versions of the two drafts, just so that members can make any, suggest any edits through markup on those. That would be really helpful, but just to underline that, close of play today, deadline for comments.
Absolutely.
Any points on process then? Okay, so Eileen, perhaps take us then into the illustrative examples on revenue.
So the second paper in agenda item 2 is specific to the revenue project, and it provides a summary of the work completed by the staff and the drafting group and changes made since December. So the first section is really about illustrative examples. Now, during the drafting as well as the subsequent review process for illustrative examples, staff in the drafting group actually identified 5 additional illustrative examples, which we originally proposed in December to actually include in IPSAS 47. But after the drafting and the review process, staff in the drafting group have noted that they didn't actually meet the board's retention requirements that we had set in December. And that's whether because they weren't really useful anymore. There were other examples that did a much better job at illustrating the principles themselves, or perhaps wasn't really illustrating a revenue principle. And so we collated a total of 5 that are listed here on the slide, and we have more details of in Appendix 1 of the paper, which we are notifying the board of that we did not bring them in as originally proposed in December. The next change on the illustrated example side was a direct response to an instruction that we got out of December, which was to add another capital transfer example. And we worked closely with the member offline, as well as with the drafting group, to make sure that we could finesse this brand new illustrative example. And that is actually example 52 in the current draft. Now, as the board may recall, the board had actually instructed the drafting group to identify any illustrative examples that require board review by exception basis only. And this was really to help better manage board plenary time, especially when working through these non-authoritative pieces of guidance. And from that, I'm happy to say that the drafting group did not identify any illustrative examples on the revenue side that would require further board consideration at this current session. Now, I'll quickly move into amendments before we start talking about comments from by exception basis. So on the amendment side, staff and the drafting group followed the approach that we agreed on in December, which included leveraging and combining the consequential amendments that were proposed in ED 70 and ED 71, and also updating for our terminology and considering amendments to the new IPSAS that have been released since the EDs went out back in early 2020. Now, in this work, staff and the drafting group did note that the exposure drafts took a slightly more simplified approach when handling the exchange and non-exchange verbiage that we have in the current IPSAS suite of standards. And so based on some reassessments with the feedback, as well as drafting group considerations, as well as the revised models that we now have in the new revenue IPSAS, we did note that the board had already acknowledged that the exchange and non-exchange concepts still exist, but that we aren't using it to delineate, classify, and therefore account for revenue in the current IPSAS 47 versus in the prior IPSAS. And so we really challenge ourselves to say where those amendments still made sense or not. And so that is an area where you'll see our changes from ED 70-71 proposals, where we actually are bringing back the use of exchange and non-exchange where they're appropriate to talk about the nature of the transaction in these other IPSAS. The one thing I also wanted to highlight here before moving on to the next 2 points is about the definitions in IPSAS 9 and IPSAS 12. I've received a few comments offline from members just asking why we show amendments to IPSAS 9 if this standard will now be replacing IPSAS 9. And it's really a matter of how we manage our handbook to make sure that we do continue to have these definitions when IPSAS 9 is replaced. And so you'll see in the amendments there that it's deleting the definitions for exchange transaction and non-exchange transaction from 9, but it's mainly to move them into IPSAS 12. And so that's why you'll see that amendment in that place. Now, in terms of other amendments that we have made that we wanted to highlight to the board, we obviously did make some changes on specific terminology, and thanks to work by the drafting group, we did also note some other areas where we didn't quite catch uses of, say, construction contracts when IPSAS 11 wasn't specifically referenced, and so it really was about cleaning up some of the amendments a little bit more, and so you'll see those in our amendments. The last 2 things we wanted to note before moving on is IPSAS 33 transitional exemption. We did speak with a few members offline about this as well, that we've essentially done the assessment again to consider whether the 3-year transitional exemption is still appropriate. And we did conclude that it is appropriate because it provides the same type of adoption relief and acknowledges the challenges, which was the purpose of IPSAS 33's transitional exemption for the existing revenue standards. Lastly, we considered IPSAS 45 and IPSAS 46, which we will be fully issuing next month. And right now, we only expect changes or amendments for IPSAS 45, but they will not be substantially different from IPSAS 17 based on our discussions with the project leads. And at this time, we do not expect any amendments will be required to IPSAS 46 measurement. Now, with that, in total, this analysis in the work has led to a total of 58 illustrative examples and 26 sets of consequential amendments. The drafting group has reviewed both of these twice this quarter, so big thank you to our drafting group for getting through so much material for us. And so staff and the drafting group are recommending adding these illustrative examples and the consequential amendments to IPSAS 47. Now, what we'd like to ask the board is whether you disagree with this recommendation, and with the support of the chair, we would like to take comments on the IEs on a exception basis only, where you have substantial comments on those IEs. We're always happy to take editorials offline. And then for the amendments, we are planning to take substantial comments by IPSAS just to help us manage the process today. So with that, I'll take down the slides and happy to pass it back to you, Chair.
Okay, so thanks, Eileen, for that. Clearly a lot of work that's been gone into this by staff, so thank you very much, and thank you again to the drafting group who've done a lot of work on our behalf. Now, in terms of the discussion, I want to split the discussion between illustrative examples and then the consequential amendments. And that's because the illustrative examples are non-authoritative. So consistent with our previous practice, that's where we will, because they've gone through the drafting group, we'll take any comments by exception. Then when we look at the consequential amendments, those are authoritative. Therefore, we will go through standard by standard just to pick up any major comments on that. So if I can take the illustrative examples first, can I check whether there's any disagreement from members about the proposed deletions of those 5 illustrative examples and the addition of that new illustrative example? Yeah, Mike.
So thank you, Chair. So no disagreement with the deletion and the add-on, but additionally, I would like to point to another important topic, that is multi-years arrangement. I think I mentioned that in the board, that even for international organizations and the donor agreements, that has caused, let's say, much trouble in the recent years in our audits. And I also would like to remind us on basis for conclusions, number 2, where we as a board are aware that there's a lack of guidance on these multi-year funding arrangements. So I know there's a Q&A in section E on page 173 saying, okay, the same principles are applied to multi-year arrangement. And there's also linkage to AG 57 and 58, where we have a distinction between wholly unsatisfied and equally unsatisfied. So our idea is you can interpret it a way that you, let's say, you cut a multi-year agreement into certain, slides of years, let's say, and then the question is, okay, are those such equally unsatisfied parts or not? And against that background, I would propose that, or think that it would be very helpful to add in this sort of example also on those multi-year agreements. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, an important area. Eileen, back on that.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Mike, for the comment, because I do remember we've had these discussions too, not just with you, but also with 2 members of our drafting group who are primary preparers within the public sector. So that's specifically the UN and the European Commission. And so, as you noted, multi-year arrangements are quite common in that space. And we have actually spoken with them quite a bit about what we could do in terms of providing supporting guidance that isn't, authoritative guidance, because the principles themselves we have confirmed are clear, and the drafting group has also noted that they are clear. So then it became a matter of, do we want to add a new illustrative example specific to multi-year arrangements that are illustrating those principles? And where we generally landed with those discussions was, to really effectively illustrate it, we would actually have to do a very full end-to-end example, which doesn't really fit with how we regularly do illustrative examples within our IPSAS. Instead, where it would actually be more helpful for them, and which they generally agreed to, was to have more of these like full-scale illustratives examples in educational material, where we could work with them directly to think through what a specific transaction or specific arrangement might look like if we were to apply the principles in the current revenue IPSAS 47. And so I guess as a summarized response, the principles associated with multi-year arrangements do exist currently in the examples themselves. We do have some examples that do showcase multi-year arrangements, but we don't call them out as explicitly. But the educational material that we can release after the issuance of the IPSAS is where I think we'll really be able to add that value to our constituents and make sure we can help them understand how the principles would look on some of those more full-scale arrangements themselves. I will pause there in case, Ross, you wanted to jump in at all, because I know you've been on those meetings with me as well with the constituents, if there's anything else to add.
Yeah, I would like to just say I completely agree with Eileen's points, and this has been a point of debate in the drafting group in developing it. And I realize the challenges with multi-year grants, but those, in my view, are IPSAS 23 application challenges. And we've propose to add the guidance in the new standard on revenue that substantially moves away from IPSAS 23 on those types of arrangements. And the principles are clear with the examples proposed in the supporting guidance. So that's why we've landed with this. If there is more needed, we do that through educational support material that we develop post that. So I think actually it'd be counterintuitive and productive with the new standard that has clear principles that help with those accounting challenges with multi-year grants if we overplayed it in the standard by putting in an example that doesn't fit with how we develop guidance. So that's why we've landed where we're not proposing that in the standard.
Okay, thanks, Ross. I mean, I think it's, it's important that we have worked this through, and I think that's where the UN system and EU have been important. I guess, Mike, just in terms of resolving your point, I think if there is anything where you think there might be a minor tweak in wording on the existing examples, illustrative examples that would help, if you could just have a think about that and pass that over to Eileen, I think that would be helpful. But I think, at this stage, we're not proposing that we would add a further illustrative example. Okay. Any other points on illustrative examples then from board members? Yeah, Noyati. You're on mute, Noyati.
I'm sorry. It's about the example 10 of ED 71 about the whether to exclude the existing example because staff suggest to not include this example, but the example 10 is illustrating whether a transaction arises from a binding arrangement, while example 1 illustrates whether there is performance obligations, which are actually two different steps in the revenue recognition. So we propose that IE 26 to be included to the justification to recognize revenue following the revenue recognition steps in the example 10. That's
okay. Thanks, Noyati. Eileen, immediate reactions to that?
Yeah, perhaps we can connect offline, Noryati, about that, because the intention of the current example 1 in the draft IPSAS 47, which is based on ED 70's example 1, it was previously about does it include a performance obligation, but we have substantially changed it to actually talk more about whether or not the arrangement is a binding arrangement. So if there are certain wording in there in the guidance that's triggering you to think about the obligations rather than binding arrangement, maybe that's what we can work offline on to clarify. But what we noted with the drafting group work is that the ED 71 example 10 would essentially be reflecting the same kind of principles that this new example would be doing. And so when we saw them side by side, when we were putting it together for IPSAS 47, it felt like we were duplicating ourselves, but not really providing anything new. There was no more additional value that was coming out of having a secondary example. So I'm happy to connect offline just to make sure that we address that point and kind of bring in what you felt was useful in ED 71's example 10 that maybe is not as in upfront within this new example 1 based on ED 70's. Is that okay? Okay, awesome. So I will email you later to connect.
Good. Okay. So I think with that, we conclude the discussion on the illustrative examples with those 5 deletions and the addition, and then those couple of pieces of offline work. So let's move on then to the consequential amendments. And as you said, Eileen, quite a list of consequential amendments. What I think we're proposing is we should walk through the list that is in Appendix 2 of your papers and just pick up any substantive comments standard by standard. Obviously, there may be minor comments there that, of an editorial nature that you want to pass through, and that's fine, that can be done. So what we want to do is just pick up any comments of substance as we walk through. And I think, Eileen, maybe I'll just walk through the numbers and we can then just see if there's any raised hands. So if we go to IPSAS 1 first, then IPSAS 2, IPSAS 4, IPSAS 5, IPSAS 9, IPSAS 12. Yeah, Andrew.
Thanks. I see we're deleting the guidance on the cost of a service provider in paragraphs 11 and 28, and rather referring that to the new cost guidance that we've got in the new revenue standard. I don't think that that's necessarily the right way to go. I think my understanding of what the intention of the cost guidance in the revenue standard is a catch-all, so that if it's not dealt with another standard, that it then defaults into the revenue guidance. And so I'd rather that we leave the existing guidance that we have in.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Andrew. So this was something I saw when we had in the ED amendments, and I kind of questioned myself in the same way. Now, my understanding of why the deletions were proposed and moved into revenue is that essentially if you are a service provider in that specific context, you are the revenue entity, the revenue earning entity. And if you are providing services and you are incurring costs associated with that, then you would just be covered under the cost to fulfill the binding arrangement and that component of the revenue IPSAS, or the revenue 47 that we will be issuing as an IPSAS. And so with that, it felt that the guidance essentially would already be under the revenue IPSAS itself. And that's why the deletion and the replacement with this new text in paragraph 11 was originally proposed. What I can do, though, is take this away and think about it a little bit further, Andrew, and see if maybe there is a clearer way that we can do so. And I can circle back with you offline.
Okay, thanks for that, Eileen. Then we go back to the list, IPSAS 16. IPSAS 17, IPSAS 18, IPSAS 19, IPSAS 21, IPSAS 24, IPSAS 26, IPSAS 27, IPSAS 28, IPSAS 29, IPSAS 30, IPSAS 31, IPSAS 32. Yeah, Patricia.
Yes, my question is related to IPSAS 31, the exception included in paragraph 6. Because I think the revenue standard, IPSAS 46, does not present requirements in relation to how account for the intangible assets. In fact, when IPSAS 46, in paragraph, I think 130, indicated that when an entity receives a non-financial assets as a consideration, should consider the specific IPSAS to account for the assets and consequently define the value of the consideration. I think this include this the inserting in IPSAS in paragraph 6, it's not appropriate here. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. Eileen, back on that.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Patricia. Just to confirm my understanding of your comment, are you proposing that the amendment to paragraph 6 here should just completely delete sub-bullet A because it would not be excluded? It should just be in IPSAS 31? Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think the insert of item G in paragraph 6 is not appropriate because it's not an exception in IPSAS 31. IPSAS 31 continue to be applicable for assets received as a consideration if the asset is classified as intangible asset.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. So it sounds like it's about 6G, so the new addition that's being added. So is this actually consistent with how the ISB had amended their intangible asset standard based on IFRS 15? And the reason is the assets arising from binding arrangements it's noting here is actually about what's being created as part of your overall arrangement. And so when something is being created, when you're creating an asset, in order to satisfy your obligations within that binding arrangement, you would need to then apply the guidance in that section of the revenue IPSAS that would require you to consider whether that is a cost that would be under IPSAS 31, or it would just be accounted for within the revenue IPSAS itself. So I guess the starting point of the analysis is intended to start in revenue, and you may end up getting deferred back into IPSAS 31, but that's what that scope exclusion is meant to really prompt the entity to consider. So it's not about what assets being received as non-cash consideration, but what asset are you creating as a result of being in that binding arrangement? I'll pass it to Ross because I see his hand's gone up.
Yeah, just to say that I think if you take this amendment out, then it makes the revenue accounting quite more complicated because the guidance for how you deal with the binding arrangement assets actually in revenue. So you have to scope it out of intangibles so that you don't create confusion. So I would not want to take that forward.
Okay. Okay, Patricia, with that explanation.
Yes, I based on the explanation, there are two situations and how I consider intangible assets in the revenue IPSAS 46. My suggestion is to specify in each situation that the intangible assets are considered not in the scope of IPSAS 31, because revenue approach intangible assets in other way that's not ISB.
Okay, so I think on that one, Eileen, if you can just work with Patricia just to see if there's any sort of signposting or whatever that we can make that a bit clearer without actually sort of shifting the approach. Claudia, are you on 31 then?
Yes, thank you. I realized we wanted to add assets arising from a binding arrangement because we have looked to the private sector standard. When I go back to our revenue standard and the recognition, it's paragraph 19a. We say any entity shall determine if any of its rights in its revenue transaction without binding arrangements meet the definition of an asset. So probably we should think about if we should also have a scope exclusion of the assets arising from non-binding arrangements.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. In terms of paragraph 19, it's referring specifically to whether assets are arising from the rights you have in the arrangement. So it wouldn't quite fall under the same kind of category or space that we're referring to here in the scope exclusion for intangible asset, because the intangible asset is really about what you're creating as a result of that arrangement. Whereas paragraph 19, they're talking about assets arising from any enforceable rights you have in your revenue arrangement, whether it's binding or not. And so that's actually more about a receivable, if you will, rather than anything in the intangible side, PP&E and other asset-related IPSAS that we have in our current suite of standards. So I think in that sense, it it's a principle relating to a different type of asset entirely. Whereas the scope exclusion in what currently proposed for IPSAS 31 here in this paragraph 6 is specific to assets you're generating as a result of your binding arrangement that would then need to be excluded from 31 and first be accounted for considering revenue IPSAS.
Okay. So with that, we move back into the list. So we were at IPSAS 32, IPSAS 33, IPSAS 35, IPSAS 40, IPSAS 41. Yeah, Andrew.
Thanks. Just two comments on IPSAS 41. The first, paragraph 3, where we talk around the impairment requirements. We say in the second last line there, transactions which give rise to financial instruments. I believe we should delete the which give rise to financial instruments because the impairment requirements also apply to binding arrangement assets.
Okay, Eileen?
Thanks, Andrew. I can take that offline and consider that amendment further.
Okay,
and
thanks, Andrew.
the second one, sorry, is then paragraph AG 34. We talk about if a guarantee is provided by an entity through a binding arrangement. I think we're then broadening the scope outside of contracts, which is what the current sort of known limit of IPSAS 41 is. And so I think that should be contracts rather than through a binding arrangement. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Okay, then we go to IPSAS 43, IPSAS 44, and then IPSAS 45. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone, for doing that review. Thanks to those members who brought up those points. So I think with that, we're through the consequential amendments. And I think, Eileen, then back to you just to wrap up the item on revenue, and then we'll take a break before we do transfer expenses.
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of next steps, I do have a set of editorial comments from members offline, and of course, some comments received from this session just now. So thank you to all the members for taking the time to review so much material at once and providing those comments. So I'll be connecting with respective members offline just to address those outstanding items. But as mentioned earlier, we will be showing any changes from this version in track changes for easier review in March. But we will be connecting offline to clarify that. And I will be working with Dave separately too, just to see any implications on that measurement piece on revenue to make sure that we are being consistent across the two projects and bringing in the thinking that is happening on measurement right now as well. With that, not too much else on the revenue side. Big thank you to everyone, and looking forward to the discussion on approval and re-exposure in March.
Okay, so thanks very much, Eileen, for that, for all the hard work that's gone into that. Thanks everyone for the hard work that's gone into reviewing and commenting, and the drafting group in particular. So with that, we take a break. We will come back then at 22 the hour. So whatever hour it is, 40. And David, as ever, will keep time on that. So thanks everyone for the input so far, and see you back in just a little over 10 minutes time. Thank you. Okay, so and also then we'll restart.
Thanks, Chair. So I'm going to go through agenda item 2.2.3, which is essentially what Eileen just did, but for transfer expenses. So in terms of changes from December, if the board will recall, in December, we have agreed to provide 11 examples in IPSAS 48. And at the meeting in December, we actually did receive comments to add one additional example for the derecognition and impairment of transfer right assets. So that has been now added as example number 8 in the draft IPSAS. And the other change since December is we have actually drafted a display and disclosure example, but after going through that with the drafting group, we've decided to remove the example. And the reason for that was because in the revised transfer expenses IPSAS, most of the presentation and disclosure requirements were actually pointing to existing IPSAS, such as IPSAS 1 on presentation, IPSAS 19 on provisions, and also IPSAS 28 and IPSAS 30 on financial instruments. So normally we do not have examples telling constituents to just go read another IPSAS. So that's why we didn't draft anything like that. But what we did draft was an example explaining the judgments involved in recognizing a transfer right asset. And the drafting group reviewed the example, and it was very evident that the example was extremely fact specific. In fact, it was almost as if the sample disclosure was really just rewording the fact pattern that we've provided. So we've decided that wouldn't really add any value for constituents. So a decision was made to remove the example on display and disclosure. So after these changes, we ended up with still 11 examples in the transfer expenses standard. And the drafting group has also determined that there were no specific issues in the illustrative examples that required additional review by the IPSASB. So in terms of amendments, we followed the same process as revenue, where we looked to the existing amendments in ED 72, and then we considered if there should be additional amendments for the upcoming IPSAS. And we actually removed a few amendments from ED 72 because if you recall, the old exposure draft had very specific presentation disclosure requirements, which were all removed as I've just mentioned before. So those amendments were no longer required. And so we've considered whether any amendments were required for IPSAS 45 or 46 and concluded that none were required. So after going through that process, we only had 5 amendments to other IPSAS, which were amendments to IPSAS 4, where we clarified that transfer right assets were non-monetary items. An amendment to IPSAS 12, where we clarified that distribution of inventory at nominal or no consideration are transfer expenses. IPSAS 33, and where we added the 3-year transitional relief for first-time adoption of IPSAS. And IPSAS 40, in the public sector combination standard, we amended the wording in one of the illustrative examples to be consistent with the transfer expense wording. And the last amendment was in IPSAS 42, social benefits, where we amended a table in the implementation guidance where we showed essentially how the non-exchange expenses that were discussed in the consultation paper ended up becoming individual IPSAS, such as IPSAS 48, social benefits, etc. So after going through that process, next slide, please. As I said, we ended up with 11 examples and 5 amendments to other IPSAS. So a lot less than revenue, but I think this is the appropriate place after talking to the drafting group.
Okay, so thanks very much for that introduction. And now if we go to we do the same process as we did before. So I just want to check whether there are any objections to the proposed changes in terms of the illustrative examples that Edwin has just outlined. Okay, and any comments by exception on the illustrative examples for transfer expenses? Good, okay, so then we move on to the consequential amendments, and if we just do those standard by standard, so anything on IPSAS 4, IPSAS 12, IPSAS 33, IPSAS 40, and then IPSAS 42. Okay, not seeing any hands raised, so content with those consequential amendments. So Edwin, any further comments from you then in terms of finalization?
Nothing substantive. So I did receive editorial comments from various members already, and I believe we have already sent out the email of the Word documents. So if there are any more editorial comments, please send them to me before the end of today. And similar to revenue, at the March meeting, we will be presenting a copy of the standard with track changes to the version from this meeting.
Okay, so I think with that, we're through item 2. Thanks everyone for bearing with us. This is, there's a lot of material here that we're trying to finalize at the same time. So we needed to work through all of that to put ourselves in a position where we can actually move to votes in the March meeting. With that, we then move on to the next paper, item 3, on the conceptual framework updates to chapter 5. And John, over to you then to introduce the item.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. This item is agenda item 3, conceptual framework, limited scope update, and it's basically looking at 2 specific matters for comment related to chapter 5 elements, and also dealing with an instruction from the December meeting on whether or not a 1-sentence, a short paragraph related to the consumption of employee services and services in kind should be retained. Dave's very kindly going to move my slides on. So if we could move on to the next slide, I'll take the standing items as read. This slide gives you an update on the approach to review of the SMC, of the specific matters for comment in Exposure Draft 81. Now, specific matters for comment 3 to 6 related to liabilities and assets. They were reviewed in December and decisions were made at that meeting. Those specific matters for comment all relate to chapter 5 on elements, as do the 2 specific matters for comment, which we're going to review in the next few minutes. They also relate to chapter 5. And basically, this gives an underpinning to the work that you've just heard about from Eileen and Edwin. So that's the reason why we've focused on these specific matters for comment in December and at this meeting. When we get to the March meeting, the last 2 specific matters for comment will be considered. They relate to prudence and obscuring information as a factor relevant to materiality. And both of those specific matters for comment relate to Chapter 3, qualitative characteristics. So the aim at this meeting is to complete the review of the specific matters for comment that relate to Chapter 5, with a view to bringing Chapter 5 to the first day of the Washington meeting for approval. Okay, if we could then move on. The first item we're looking at in pages 6 to 12 is accounting for binding arrangements that are equally unperformed. And the recommendation is as given in the paper and on that slide. There was generally few reservations about including a subsection on binding arrangements that are equally unperformed. However, there was quite a few reservations were expressed about including this in the subsection on unit of account rather than in its own subsection. And if we look at the IASB's 2018 conceptual framework, the subsection on executory accounting was separate from unit of account, and some of the respondents highlighted that. Others highlighted that in their view, the considerations relating to binding arrangements that are equally unperformed go further than unit of account, and in particular relate to aspects of the definition of an asset and a liability. Board sponsor Ian and I have looked at that, and we're quite persuaded by the views of those respondents. So the proposal is that the wording of the subsection should be as exposed in ED 81, but it should be in a separate subsection. At that point, Chair, I'll leave that open for any comments.
Okay, thanks, John. So anybody disagree with that proposal? Okay, so I think we're fine with that.
Okay.
So move us on to the next paper.
The next specific matter for comment is specific matter for comment 7, and that's on unit of account. And this, of course, was related to the binding arrangements that are equally unperformed that I've just discussed. Again, there was relatively few reservations about the proposal to include a subsection on unit of account, subject to the comments that I've just made. There were some comments asking for greater exemplification in the conceptual framework. Neither board sponsor nor I think that going into, for instance, an inventory of potential unit of account in the conceptual framework is appropriate, and indeed it would be fraught with risks. So the recommendation is as in the slide and as in agenda item 3.2.2, that the guidance on unit of account as exposed in ED 81 should be included in revised Chapter 5, subject to some very minor editorial amendments and the relocation to the subsection of the paragraphs on binding arrangements that are equally unperformed. That you've just agreed to. So the question is whether or not you agree with the recommendation to retain the subsection on unit of account with the modifications that I've just highlighted. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Anybody disagree with the proposal there? Claudia?
I don't disagree with the proposal. I just want to ask for an addition in the BCs.
Yeah.
We have in table 3 there is a response to a request if you have different units of account for recognition and measurement. And I would just add something in the BC saying that there could be different units of account for recognition and measurement, but they are dealt on standard level and not in the conceptual framework.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Claudia. That's noted.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay. So with that, the consent on that item. So move us on then, John.
Yeah. The next issue responds to an instruction at the December meeting, and this was to provide a little bit further analysis on a paragraph in 5.7c of Chapter 5. This is in the section dealing with rights in the guidance on the definition of an asset. And what this guidance says is, as listed in the, as shown on the slide, that some goods and services that are received and immediately consumed give rise to a right to obtain economic benefits, and therefore, very briefly, an asset should be recognized. I think some members questioned quite why we were dealing with this issue in this section. The answer to that being that because it does relate to rights. And they also asked for an explanation of quite how an asset would arise. Now, without getting into a huge amount of detail, this flows really from the approach to assets and liabilities in IPSASB's literature, or rather the approach to financial performance in IPSASB's literature. Whilst the IPSASB hasn't been overt in espousing what in the paper I've called an assets and liabilities led approach to financial reporting and to financial performance, it's clear that the approach that we're generally adopting is closer to that assets and liability led approach than to the alternative revenue and expenses led approach that I've briefly sketched out in the agenda item. Because we've really adopted implicitly an assets and liabilities led approach, revenue expenses flow from changes in assets and liabilities, and therefore it's important that you have to establish an asset or a liability before you determine revenue or expense. So that is why it's appropriate to include this this paragraph in Chapter 5 in the subsection on rights. So the staff recommendation is to retain paragraph 5.7c rather than delete it. So again, through the chair, I'll ask the members if they agree with that recommendation.
Thanks, John, for that explanation. So we content with retention then? Okay, seeing any hands raised? Oh, Renee.
Yes, thank you. I do agree with the retention. Something that we reflected on is, I think it's in one of the BCs related to this in the IFRS framework. They're providing a bit more substance in terms of a real life example to help preparers understand how this works. You know, is there an asset to record or not? And I think what we're saying is that there's no asset to record because there's no sufficient amount of time, you know, while we say this asset exists for a moment. So I think that the IFRS BC related to the same topic offered a bit more useful context. So I was just wondering, John, if it would be valuable to maybe try to bring some of this in the BC to really help, because it's an odd concept, you know, this concept that an asset exists for a minute. Okay, well, if it exists, do I record it? No, but so maybe, I think the examples are helping to articulate the intent. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that, Renee. I mean, by and large, I think we've tried to not go into too many examples, but I do agree with you that this is a rather difficult, well, it's just, you know, when I first looked at this, I thought it was intuitively just contradictory, and it was only when, you know, I did the little bit of analysis that I've done, and this dates back actually years to the development of the original proposals in one of the consultation papers for the 2014 framework. But yes, I will look at that exemplification in the ISB and see if there's aspects of that I can bring forward. Okay, so thank you for that. I'll treat that as an instruction along with Claudia's.
Yeah, so I think, again, it's about striking that balance between providing that bit of explanation without getting too heavy on that, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so then with that, move us then into the fourth paper, which is looking at the changes then.
Yeah, what the fourth paper does is try to just indicate areas where I've made changes since the version that you saw in December. So really it needs to be looked at together with the updated draft chapter 5 at agenda item 3.3.1. I think it's fair to say that most of these changes are really fairly minor drafting or editorial. Some of them go a bit further than that. For example, we talked about paragraph 5.7c. One of the respondents suggested that we should change the term capability to right. That looks minor, but I think it was quite an important identification of a term that was inappropriate and its replacement with a term which fits the context better. Similarly, there have been a couple of areas in the basis for conclusion where we've added material which cross-references. An example of that to highlight is paragraph BC 5.18, where I think, again, this responded to a view from the December meeting that we should cross-reference and emphasize that the updated definition of a liability and any supporting guidance doesn't affect the discussion of sovereign powers and rights. Okay, so we've added a little bit of material there, but most of this, I would hope, is relatively straightforward. Is the best way to proceed on this, Ian, rather than sort of going through on a page-by-page basis here? I ask for any editorials by close of play today, Toronto time.
Yeah, I think so in terms of editorials. Again, if staff can just circulate the Word version of the revised chapter 5.
Yeah.
Can provide any final editorials on that. I just want to ask if there are any of those summarised changes in paragraph 6 that board members have concerns about that they want to discuss at this stage. Okay, so I think with that, then any final edits to John by close of play, and then again we will bring back the updated chapter 5 for a vote on day 1 of the March meeting.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Thanks, John. Anything else you need from us?
No, that's it from me, Ian. Thank you. And
Okay.
thanks to the board for the decisions and the 2 instructions.
Okay, that's good. So with that, we are through all 3 items. Just to underline once again, in all cases, if there are final pieces of editorial you want considered before the version that we will vote on, versions we will vote on in March by close of play, so the end of today in Toronto time. Ross, perhaps back to you just to round off in terms of process and so on.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to members, TAs, observers for all the hard work on the long list of approvals that's been building since last summer, actually. And I think the finalization process started principally at the December meeting, and obviously today's check-in's an important meeting in getting the content of the major items for approval in March. The various staff on each of their projects have kind of outlined what's left to do in the various projects, but I did think it would be useful just to highlight the approval heavy meeting that we have upcoming in about 3 weeks' time, and the importance of us kind of moving through this logjam of approvals. So just to remind board members, technical advisors and observers, so we will be looking to finalize approval for the measurement standard. We will be looking to approve conceptual framework, limited scope update chapter 5 that we've just discussed. We will be looking to approve both the revenue and the transfer expenses standards. That will also include a significant discussion on the need for re-exposure for each of those new standards. And just a reminder that ED 83 is back, and we've assessed the responses to that limited scope project add sustainability guidance to RPG 1 and RPG 3. And we will be looking for approval of those non-authoritative amendments related to sustainability in March as well. So it is a pretty heavy docket of approvals. We've been setting it up well, going back to 2022, but it will be a challenging meeting. I would say the one thing that makes me comfortable from a staff perspective that we're almost there is we have given more time to the board to work through these long documents going back September, December last year. We don't have substantive issues on any of the major projects outstanding. If some of you have been around the table for a while, will recall a couple of approvals in the last couple of years. We were trying to land a few issues and approve at the same meeting. I'm confident going in to this board meeting that those issues are off the table for measurement, revenue, transfer expenses. The use of drafting groups has been very helpful to get the text in a good place. And of course, there will be an editorial process for all of these approvals that will deal with editorial considerations, consistency, things like that we deal with through that process offline. So I just want to make sure everybody's comfortable with that process and aware of what staff's planning, and to make sure that everybody's prioritizing their preparation and review for the upcoming board meeting to be ready for those approval discussions. With that, that's all from me, Ian.
Okay, so thanks, Ross. And just to underline, thanks to everybody for the hard work that's gone into bringing this group of projects through to the state that we can have votes on each of them in March. Dave.
Just a quick reminder to the 2 or 3 members that want to stay on to talk editorials, please stay on.
Okay. So with that, I think we can close today's session. I think it has been very useful. So thanks everyone for the input that you provided today. And with that, we will give you 50 minutes back on your day today. And look forward to seeing everybody in Washington. I think obviously we've got the approvals at the front end of the meeting, but we've got a lot of interesting discussions to come up on other projects as we bring back retirement benefit plans, natural resources, sustainability. We will have a number of opportunities to discuss that, and then also looking forward to the development of the strategy for the next 5 years, 2024 through to 2028. So it's going to be a busy meeting, but I think also, you know, a feeling of achievement as we move through finalisation, and interesting as we start to discuss some new topics as well. So a lot to look forward to in DC, as well as, of course, the event co-hosted with IMF on the first day. So thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you there. Travel safely, and you know, enjoy the break in the meantime before we hit the meeting. So thanks everyone, and see you again all too soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So I'm expecting at least Patricia, Claudia, Andrew, and Eileen.
If you don't need me around for this, do you?